Good evening and welcome back. Pull your chair a little closer, wherever you are, and do let me know. Drop it in the comments or send a message. Whether you are listening from somewhere cold tonight, somewhere where the wind has teeth, or somewhere the heat still sits on the stones long after the sun has gone, it matters to me. It always matters to me. I like to think of this as a room we share, however far apart we sit in it. And tonight, the room is going to get very large indeed, because tonight we're going back. Not a century, not a millennium. We are going to the edge of memory itself, to the moment when the world that made the world ended, and something, we are still not sure what, walked out of the fire and became us. Tonight, we talk about the Sea Peoples. Tonight, we talk about the Bronze Age collapse. And I want to be honest with you from the start. This is a story that has no clean edges. The historians fight about it. The archaeologists dig up something new every decade that reshuffles the deck. There are gaps in the record of where whole civilizations used to be. So I'm going to do what I always do in those gaps. I'm going to follow the thread wherever the evidence allows. And where it does not, I'm going to tell you that is what I am doing. There will be no pretending here. There is too much at stake. Let us begin at the beginning, which is to say, let us begin in the bronze. Before there was a collapse, there was a world, and the world was extraordinary. Understand what the Eastern Mediterranean looked like in, say, 1400 BCE. Not as a historical abstraction, as a living, breathing, sweating, arguing, trading, dreaming system of civilizations that had been building for 1,000 years before anyone thought to write the moment down. The palace at Knossos on Crete was already ancient. The great temple complexes of Egypt had been rising and falling and rising again along the Nile for so long that the Egyptians themselves had begun to mythologize their own past. The Hittites had carved an empire from the Anatolian plateau with iron will and bronze weapons. Ugarit sat on the Syrian coast like a jewel in a setting of cedar and sea salt, its merchants speaking 4 languages in the same sentence, its scribes writing in cuneiform on clay tablets they would stack in archives cool as cellars. Mycenaean Greeks built citadels on limestone hills and sent their ships east and south and west, and they traded and they raided, and sometimes it was difficult to tell the difference. This was the world, not a primitive world, not a simple world, a world of complexity so dense that modern scholars who specialize in it spend entire careers on single decades, on single cities, on single ceramic traditions, and still feel they have only touched the surface. The copper came from Cyprus, mostly, that island whose very name, in Latin, would give the metal its name, cuprum. The tin came from somewhere farther, somewhere still debated, Afghanistan perhaps, or the mines of the Taurus Mountains, or trade routes so long and indirect that no single merchant knew their full length. Tin and copper, smelted together, produced bronze. Bronze produced weapons and tools and prestige objects, the cups that kings drank from, the armor that soldiers died in, the figurines that priestesses carried in processions no living person has ever seen. The grain moved too. Egypt was the grain country, the breadbasket that fed the Eastern world in bad harvest years. And there were always bad harvest years somewhere. Mycenaean wine and oil moved in painted jars. Ugaritic purple dye, extracted from murex shellfish in quantities that made the extraction itself an industry, colored the robes of kings from Thebes to Hattusa. Amber came from the Baltic, carried overland by routes through the Danubian corridor that passed through a dozen polities and changed hands a dozen times before it reached the palace storerooms of the Aegean. Egyptian blue pigment, an artificial compound of copper and silica, traveled in the other direction. It is almost too much to hold in one thought. The sheer scale of it, the interdependence. That is precisely the point. That is why what happened next was so total. The palace civilizations, and this is the correct term for them, civilizations organized around large, hierarchical, redistributive palace complexes. The palace civilizations of the late Bronze Age were not merely wealthy, they were structurally dependent on each other. The specialization had gone so deep, the trade networks had become so elaborate, the administrative systems so fine-tuned to the management of long-distance exchange, that a disruption anywhere in the system sent shocks everywhere else in the system. The palace at Mycenae stored olive oil, not because Mycenaean warriors ate olive oil, but because olive oil was a trade good, a currency of substance, a thing that moved across the sea and came back as copper and gold. Remove the copper, remove the tin, remove the grain in a drought year, remove the safe passage of ships, remove any single load-bearing beam in that architectural marvel of a trading network, and watch what happens to the rest. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The world has not ended yet. It is still 1400 BCE, and the world is full of letters. The Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt in the 1880s, a cache of diplomatic correspondence that rewrote what we thought we knew about Bronze Age international relations. The Amarna letters are perhaps the most intimate window we have into this world. They were written in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the age, on small clay tablets, and they passed between the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of Babylon and Assyria and Mitanni and Hatti and Cyprus and a dozen smaller polities. And they are full of the texture of actual human beings navigating power. A king asks for gold, saying Egypt has gold like dust. A queen writes in apparent distress after her husband's death, asking an enemy king to send her a prince to marry because she cannot face marrying one of her own servants. And the Hittite archives record this letter with visible astonishment because the request was extraordinary and because the prince who was sent was murdered on his way, and the event almost started a war. A minor vassal writes in terror that his enemies are closing in and his ally has not answered his last 7 letters, and he does not know if anyone is listening. Someone was listening. Someone always was. The palace scribal systems were meticulous. These were not improvised communications. These were the formal outputs of a bureaucratic tradition that had been refining itself for centuries, that trained young men for years before allowing them to press a stylus to fresh clay in the name of a king. I find myself wanting to dwell here, in this moment before the break. I am aware that is a choice I'm making, and I'm not entirely sure it is defensible in a purely narrative sense, but I think it matters. It matters to hold the world whole before we watch it come apart. It matters to know what was lost, because it was going to be lost. The whole apparatus, the whole shining, complicated, interconnected world of it. The signs were already there, though no one reading those Amarna letters in 1350 BCE could have named them as such. Drought cycles were beginning to intensify in the eastern Mediterranean. The dendrochronological evidence, the tree ring data from ancient timber preserved in archaeological sites, tells us the region entered a period of prolonged climate instability sometime around the end of the 13th century BCE. Not immediately catastrophic, not the kind of drought that kills everyone in a generation, the slow kind, the grinding kind, the kind that depletes seed grain reserves over decades, that turns marginal farmland to dust, that pushes pastoral populations off their traditional ranges and into contact, hostile contact, with settled farmers who are themselves already stretched thin. The movement of peoples was beginning. Not yet the wave that would break on the Bronze Age shores and leave nothing standing. Not yet. But the restlessness was there. In the hill country behind Ugarit, in the Aegean Islands, where small communities were beginning to see strangers arrive, hungry and armed. In the Libyan desert west of the Nile Delta, where confederacies of tribes who had long existed in a kind of understood tension with Egypt were beginning to feel the push of something behind them. Some say the Sea Peoples were a coherent group, a nation or a federation of nations who arose from some specific place, Anatolia, the Aegean, the Western Mediterranean, and made a concerted effort to destroy the Bronze Age world. Others say they were not a group at all, not in any meaningful ethnic or political sense, but a category, a label the Egyptians applied to various and distinct peoples who arrived by sea from the north and west, a catch-all term for the frightening stranger, the one who came off a ship with a weapon. The truth, as it usually does, sits somewhere between the two positions. And to understand it, we have to go back even further, to the wars that shaped the world before the collapse, to the generations of violence and accommodation that produced the tensions the Sea Peoples would eventually shatter. We have to go back to the great power struggle of the Bronze Age. We have to go to Kadesh. The Battle of Kadesh was fought around 1274 BCE, and it was, depending on how you count such things, either the largest chariot battle in history, or at minimum, the best documented chariot battle in history, because Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great, the pharaoh who outlived almost everyone and who never met a wall that didn't deserve his name carved into it, Ramesses II had it recorded in exhaustive, operatic, partially fabricated detail on the walls of 5 separate temples. The opponent was the Hittite king Muwatalli II, and the prize was the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River in what is now Syria, the city whose control meant control of the northern Levantine trade corridors. A city worth fighting, a generation over. The battle itself was, by most military historical assessments, a near catastrophe for Egypt. Ramesses rode into a trap, a brilliant Hittite deception involving false defectors who gave him bad intelligence about the enemy's position, and found himself nearly encircled before a combination of his own personal courage, or so the Egyptian records insist, and the timely arrival of reinforcements turned imminent disaster into something that could be called, with enough creative accounting, a draw. The resulting peace treaty, the Treaty of Kadesh, sealed around 1258 BCE, was the first recorded international peace treaty in history. Copies exist in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform. A reproduction hangs in the United Nations headquarters in New York, which is either heartening or ironic depending on your reading of history. What matters for our story is not the battle itself, but what it revealed. It revealed that the two great superpowers of the age, Egypt and Hatti, had fought themselves to a standstill. Neither could destroy the other. Both needed the other to survive, not affectionately, not without resentment, but structurally, as counterweights in a system that required balance. The treaty was not an act of friendship. It was an act of exhausted necessity, and the exhaustion mattered because the great powers were tired and the world around them was shifting, and the next generation of kings would inherit not just the thrones, but the fatigue. The Hittite Empire had been built on a particular genius for incorporation. Hittite kings were remarkable in the context of their era for their pragmatism about cultural diversity. Conquered peoples were often allowed to keep their gods, their languages, their local administrative systems, provided they paid tribute and supplied soldiers when called. The empire was a vast mosaic, held together less by ethnic homogeneity than by a sophisticated network of treaties and obligations. Vassal kings swore oaths. Those oaths were recorded. The Hittite archives at Hattusa, the capital in north-central Anatolia, preserved thousands of these documents, a bureaucratic record of empire whose scale and organization rivals anything the ancient world produced. The weakness of such a system is the same as its strength. The treaties only hold while there is power to enforce them. The mosaic only coheres while the center is strong, and the center in the late 13th century BCE was beginning to show cracks. Internal succession disputes had weakened Hittite royal authority through the reigns of several kings. The western frontiers were restless. A confederation of Anatolian peoples and Aegean groups, the Hittites called the Ahiyawa, almost certainly the Achaeans, the Mycenaean Greeks, known to Homer as the great warriors of the Trojan War, were pressing at the boundaries, sometimes raiding, sometimes negotiating, always watching. The eastern frontier faced Assyrian resurgence. The southern vassal states required constant attention, and through all of this, the grain situation was worsening. Letters survived from the late Hittite kings requesting grain from Egypt with an urgency that is almost audible across 3,000 years. There is a famine in the land of Hatti. One letter reads, "Save me." Egypt sent grain. The system still held, but it was holding in the way a rope holds when too many people are pulling it in too many directions, and somewhere in the fibers, things are already giving way. Meanwhile, in the Aegean, something was happening that would later be called, by the archaeologists who excavated its layers of ash, a destruction. The palace at Mycenae survived. The palace at Tiryns survived for a time. But other sites, Thebes in Boeotia, various smaller palace centers in the Peloponnese, showed destruction layers dating to around 1250 to 1200 BCE. Not all at once, not in a single event. A burning here, an abandonment there, a population that stops rebuilding and starts moving. The Mycenaean world was already unraveling from within before the sea peoples became a historical presence in the Egyptian records. Some scholars argue, and I find the argument compelling though not conclusive, that displaced Mycenaeans were among the sea peoples themselves, that the collapse of the Aegean palace world sent its people into the sea as migrants and raiders, and that what Egypt eventually faced was partly the wreckage of a world that had already ended elsewhere. If so, there's a terrible elegance to it. The refugee becomes the destroyer. The victim becomes the instrument of the next catastrophe. This is not a new story, but it was perhaps the first time it played out at this scale. Let me collect the thread here, because we have covered ground quickly and the threads are multiplying. We have the late Bronze Age world, interconnected, specialized, brilliant, fragile. We have the climate beginning to turn. We have the great powers, Egypt and Hittite, exhausted by their own conflict and locked into a peace that is also a mutual dependence. We have the Mycenaean world already fraying at its edges. We have the movement of peoples beginning, not yet catastrophic, building in pressure behind the horizons that the palace scribes can still pretend are distant. Now, we need to talk about what held the system together, because understanding the system is understanding why, when it broke so completely. The late Bronze Age international order, and it deserves to be called an order, a real, functioning, maintained order, rested on three foundations. The first was the palace redistribution economy. Palaces collected surplus production, grain, oil, wool, bronze, and redistributed it through a hierarchical system that fed specialists, scribes, soldiers, craftsmen, priests, managed stockpiles for lean years, and generated the prestige goods that oiled diplomatic relationships. This system required stability, predictability, and above all, continued surplus. It had no resilience against sustained scarcity. The second foundation was the long-distance trade network. Copper from Cyprus, tin from the east, grain from Egypt, timber from Lebanon, purple dye from Ugarit. Every palace economy was embedded in this network and dependent on it for materials it could not source locally. Disrupt the network and the palace workshops slow, then stop. Stop the workshops and the prestige goods stop flowing. Stop the prestige goods and the diplomatic relationships that maintain the order, the gifts, the marriage alliances, the tokens of mutual recognition between kings. Those relationships begin to hollow out. The third foundation was something harder to name. Let me try. It was consensus. The shared agreement maintained across generations of kings and scribes and merchants that the system was worth maintaining, that the rules, the protocols of diplomatic exchange, the obligations of the vassal treaty, the understood boundaries between spheres of influence, that these rules were real and consequential. When Ramesses and Muatali signed their treaty, the act had meaning not just because both kings were watching, but because an entire civilization of scribes and officials and merchants and priests was watching, and their watching gave the act its weight. Consensus of this kind is invisible when it works. It becomes visible only when it stops working, and by then it is usually too late to simply reconstitute it. The late Bronze Age world had built, over centuries, an astonishing edifice of shared meaning. Letters traveled between kings who had never met, yet who addressed each other as brothers, as fathers, as sons in the formal kinship language of diplomacy. The language was not sincere affection. It was a code, a protocol, a recognized system of mutual recognition that said, we are both part of this world, and we both acknowledge that the world is real. Egyptian merchants had names for Ugaritic counterparts they may never have seen. Hittite vassals swore oaths to gods they may not have believed in temples they may never have visited. None of it needed to be sincere. It needed to be maintained. When it stopped being maintained, when the first king stopped answering letters, when the first vassal stopped sending tribute, not out of rebellion, but out of incapacity, when the first merchant ship stayed in harbor because the route was not safe anymore, the consensus began to dissolve. And dissolving consensus does not announce itself. It does not send a herald. It happens in the quiet between messages, in the unanswered letter, in the city that has stopped sending its annual report, in the harbor that used to be full of ships and is now full of silence. Now the heroes, because no great collapse happens without great individuals moving through it, making choices that seem local and turn out to be epical, wielding power they do not fully understand, driven by ambitions or fears that make perfect sense in the moment and look from 3,000 years away, like figures in a dream that was always going to end this way. Ramesses III was not the same man as Ramesses II, though he borrowed the great Pharaoh's name and, some argue, his entire self-presentation, consciously modeling his reign and his temples and his records on the legendary ancestor who had made Egypt synonymous with permanence. He was, and this detail is important, a pharaoh who came to power in a time of transition and instability during the so-called Ramesside period, when the great 19th dynasty was giving way to the 20th, when the Egyptian court was convulsed by plots and counterplots, and the succession itself was uncertain. His birth is obscure in the way that the births of powerful men often become obscure. The official record presents him as the destined heir, the chosen of Amun, the son who is always going to be king. But the actual mechanics of his rise suggest something more contingent, more fought over. His father, Sednakta, had himself seized power after a period of chaos, and Ramesses III inherited not just a throne, but a project of restoration. He was, from the beginning, a man who defined himself against disorder. He was trained in the tradition of the warrior pharaoh. He learned to drive a chariot, to draw a composite bow from the horseback, to read the logistical documents that moving an army required. He studied the temple records, the annals, the great accounts of Thutmose III's campaigns to the north, the battle narratives of Ramesses II, which by his generation had already achieved the status of sacred text. He knew what a pharaoh was supposed to be. He prepared to be it. What he could not have prepared for, what no preparation would have made comprehensible, was the scale of what was coming. In his 5th year as pharaoh, the Libyans came. The western desert, that great buffer zone between the Nile world and whatever lay beyond it, had been restless for generations. But now the pressure was immense. A confederation of Libyan tribes pushed from behind by something the records do not fully explain. Climate displacement, demographic pressure, the radiating shock of disruptions further north, came into the delta in force. Ramesses met them and drove them back. He recorded the victory on the walls of Medinet Habu, his mortuary temple on the west bank of Thebes, and he was not modest about it. Then, in his 8th year, they came from the sea. The inscription at Medinet Habu, which is one of the most important historical documents in human possession, and which deserves more than the brief citations it usually gets in popular history. The inscription describes what happened with a vividness that is still startling after 3,000 years. The text describes a great coalition of peoples: the Peleset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. These names have been debated and etymologized and mapped onto later peoples with varying degrees of scholarly confidence. The Peleset are almost certainly the Philistines of the Hebrew Bible, the people who gave Palestine its name. The Shekelesh may be Sicilians, or a people who later became associated with Sicily. The Denyen have been connected, tentatively, to the Danaans of Homer. The Checker may be related to the Teucrians of Troy. Some say the coalition was organized, a deliberate military campaign with strategic objectives. Others say it was a migration under military pressure, a people moving because they had nowhere else to go, fighting because they had to fight to survive the journey. The Medinet Habu inscription says they moved with their families. It says they came by sea and by land simultaneously, that there were ox carts full of women and children moving along the Levantine coast as the fleet moved parallel to it, just offshore. This is not the image of a raiding party. This is the image of a people who have burned their previous home and are never going back. Ramesses prepared. He is the reason we know as much as we do, because he was a pharaoh who documented everything, who had his victories and his scares, if you read carefully, carved into stone that has survived 32 centuries. He fortified the Nile Delta mouths. He positioned his fleet. He trained his soldiers. He called on his gods with the urgency of a man who understands that this is the moment, the one that will define everything, the one that he was, perhaps, made for. The battle was fought, most likely, at a Nile Delta mouth. The exact location is debated, and it was, by any measure, a decisive Egyptian victory. The relief carvings at Medinet Habu show Egyptian ships with archers standing in the prows, raking the enemy ships with arrows, while Ramesses himself stands on the bank, directing the battle with the posture of a god and the eyes of a man who is concentrating very, very hard. The enemy fleet was caught, entangled, overwhelmed. Prisoners were taken in thousands. The threat was broken. And then, and here is the human detail that I find myself returning to again and again, that I cannot explain why it matters this much, but it does. It sits in my mind like a stone. And then Ramesses ordered the prisoners processed, documented, and settled. Not executed, settled. In Egypt, in the Delta, in the military colonies that would, over the following generations, transform from prisoner camps to integrated communities. The Peleset, the Philistines, were settled in Canaan, the very land that the Hebrew scriptures would later frame as their enemy's territory, their ancient adversary, the sea people who had always been there, blocking the promised land. The people who tried to destroy Egypt became part of Egypt's frontier. The refugees became the garrison. The wave became a wall. Ramesses won. He won completely, and it cost him something he could not have named at the time, but that we can see clearly from here. The victory consumed resources, grain, bronze, manpower, administrative attention that the palace system could not easily replace. Egypt survived the sea peoples. Egypt did not survive surviving them, not in the same form. The 20th dynasty declined through Ramesses III's successors, each one named Ramesses, and each one less effectual than the last, until the name became a kind of ritual repetition, a spell that no longer worked. The pharaoh's power drained away into the hands of the temple priests and the military commanders, and the new kingdom ended not with a battle, but with an administrative rearrangement that even the Egyptians who lived through it may not have recognized as an ending. Ramesses III himself ended badly. The Harris papyrus, discovered in the 19th century, and the judicial papyrus of Turin reveal that at the end of his reign there was a conspiracy, a Harem conspiracy, in which his secondary wife and a group of court officials attempted to assassinate the pharaoh and place her son on the throne. Recent forensic analysis of Ramesses III's mummy, conducted in 2012, and the findings were remarkable enough that even the most professionally restrained archaeologists used words like shocking. The forensic analysis found evidence of a deep cut to the throat, consistent with a knife wound, almost certainly fatal. His throat had been cut, and he had been mummified anyway. The wound packed and wrapped, the body made presentable for eternity by embalmers who must have worked with a certain grim professionalism. He had saved Egypt from the sea peoples. He had been killed by his own family. The legacy was genuine. Egypt endured. The Philistines endured. The memory of the great battle endured. Carved into stone, recorded in papyrus, preserved in the particular way that only stone preservation preserves things. Perfectly, coldly, without the warmth of the actual moment, but there where nothing else was. His name was Suppiluliuma II, and he was the last king of the Hittite Empire, and almost nothing he did was enough. He is not Ramesses. I want to be direct about that. The records are scant, the evidence fragmentary, and there is a temptation to fill the gaps with drama that the evidence cannot support. I will try to resist that temptation and only partially succeed. What we know, Suppiluliuma II came to the throne around 1207 BCE, possibly later, inheriting an empire that was already under severe stress. His father Tudhalia IV had fought significant campaigns to hold the western Anatolian frontier and had engaged in what appears to have been a major naval conflict in the eastern Mediterranean. The Hittites, remarkably, had a fleet operating from Cyprus and the Levantine coast, and Tudhalia's records describe sea battles against what he called the Alasians, the Cypriots, though some scholars read these as proxy conflicts involving Aegean peoples as well. Suppiluliuma II continued these campaigns. There are inscriptions in Luwian hieroglyphics, a script that was not fully deciphered until the 20th century, which itself tells you something about how thoroughly this world was forgotten. Inscriptions that describe naval victories, campaigns in Cyprus, the reassertion of Hittite control over trading routes. He was fighting hard. He was fighting competently by the evidence. He was not losing the wars he fought. He was losing the empire. The Hittite heartland was running out of grain. The letters we have, fragmentary as they are, document a food crisis of worsening severity. The climate was squeezing. The administrative system that had held the empire together was, one layer at a time, ceasing to function. Vassal states stopped reporting. Trade routes grew unsafe. The great archive at Hattusa, which had been maintained with fastidious care for centuries, shows signs of hasty organization in its final layers. Tablets stored improperly, records not followed up, the small signs of a bureaucracy that is no longer running at full capacity. At some point, and we cannot date it precisely, which is itself part of the horror, at some point, Hattusa was destroyed, burned. The excavations show a catastrophic destruction layer, ash, collapsed walls, bronze objects melted and fused, the ruins of a city that went down in a fire intense enough to vitrify the mud brick walls in places, turning them to a kind of rough ceramic. There are no records from Hattusa after the destruction. There are no letters, no treaties, no administrative documents, no royal annals. The archive simply stops. Suppiluliuma II disappears from the record. We do not know how he died. We do not know if he escaped. We do not know if he was in Hattusa when it burned, or if he was somewhere else, watching the smoke rise from a distance that made him safe and useless at the same time. Some say the Kashgar, the tribal peoples of the Pontic region to the north, destroyed Hattusa. They had raided the Hittite heartland before, more than once, been repelled before, but this time, perhaps not. Others say it was internal collapse, a population that simply abandoned the capital in the chaos of systemic failure, and that the fire was not the cause, but the final symptom. Others still argue for a combination: internal weakness that made the defense impossible, external pressure that made it unnecessary. I do not know. I want to tell you I know, but I do not. What I know is that the Hittite Empire, which had been one of the two great superpowers of the late Bronze Age, which had fought Ramesses II to a standstill at Kadesh, which had maintained a diplomatic correspondence with Egypt and Babylon and Assyria for 2 centuries, which had given us some of the earliest legal codes and the first international peace treaty in human history. That empire ended completely in a generation. And the people who were Hittites, the farmers, the craftsmen, the soldiers, the scribes whose learning had been so carefully transmitted, those people scattered into the hills and valleys of Anatolia and became something else, or they moved, or they survived in the small Neo-Hittite kingdoms that clung to the Syrian fringe for another few centuries before the Assyrians arrived and made even those ghost lights go out. Suppiluliuma II, the last king. His name meant, in Hittite, something like man of the spring, the word for the pure, cold water that came up from underground. He was the last living water of a tradition 3 centuries deep, and then he was gone, and the spring dried up, and the land above it cracked and blew away in the wind off the plateau. There was a man, and here I must ask your patience, because I am going to invent him, and I want to tell you I am doing that before I do it, because the invention is made from real material, even if the man himself is not in the records. Call him what you like. The Medinet Habu inscription gives us names for the groups, not for the individuals. Call him, for the purposes of this night, Akaios. The name would fit, roughly, some of the linguistic speculation. Call him Akaios and understand that he stood for 10,000 like him, or 100,000. Akaios was born on a shore that had a name once and does not have that name anymore. Some say the name was connected to what we now call the Aegean littoral, the western coast of Anatolia, the islands. Some say further west, the southern Aegean, or even Crete, or the coast of Greece that the Mycenaean collapse had by then rendered uninhabitable for the life his parents had known. His parents had known a palace world, is the thing, not at the center of it. They were not king's scribes or bronze smiths with palace contracts. They were the people who lived near enough to the system to be integrated into it without being secured by it. The farmers who sold surplus grain to the palace collectors, the fishermen who paid in dried catch for the protection of a local lord who himself owed fealty to a Mycenaean king who owed something to the international order. They were the people the system fed last, in a scarcity, and abandoned first, when the scarcity became permanent. His childhood was the smell of smoke. Not metaphorically. The decade of his childhood was a decade in which things burned. Grain stores, because the harvests failed and people fought over what remained. Villages, because the people who had been peaceful before the grain ran out were not peaceful anymore. Ships in harbors, because the sea itself was becoming contested territory. He grew up knowing that the world his parents had described to him was not the world he lived in, and he was young enough that he did not grieve this as loss. He simply understood it as the condition of existence. The world is fire and movement, and the ones who survive are the ones who move faster than the fire. He was tall. I have no evidence for this. I am told the skeletal remains from late Bronze Age sites in the Aegean show a range of statures comparable to modern populations, which tells us nothing about any individual. But he was tall in the way that matters in a story. He took up space in a room. People looked at him. When he spoke, the quality of the room changed. He had a gift. This is not invention. This is the distilled attribute of every successful chieftain in every mobile military community in history, the one quality without which the others are useless. He had a gift for making people want to follow him, not through fear, though he could inspire fear, through something harder to name, a quality of attention perhaps, a way of looking at the person in front of him as if that person were the most important intelligence source in the world, which, when you are moving through hostile territory, with no fixed base and no supply line, and your next meal is always a tactical problem, every person you encounter actually is. He was a good listener. In a world where most leaders led by display, Akaios led by absorption. He gathered them. This is the essential fact of his existence, the thing that explains why the Egyptian records describe not raiding parties, but coalitions, not pirates, but peoples. He gathered them. The dispossessed from the Aegean coast, the survivors from burned Mycenaean satellite communities, the Anatolian pastoralists who had been pushed off their seasonal ranges by the drought, the Cypriot merchants whose trading networks had collapsed and who had ships and nowhere to go, the Levantine coastal communities that saw the fire coming from the north and made a calculation about which direction to run. He made them a people by moving them. This is a thing that happens in history, in extremity. The shared experience of displacement creates the solidarity that fixed communities generate through time and shared territory. The Sea Peoples were not a nation when they started. They became something like a nation in the moving. The ox carts with the women and children that the Medinet Habu inscription describes. Those were not camp followers. Those were the people, the community, the thing being protected. A chaos fought. He was not pacifist. The communities he moved through, the cities of the Levantine coast, some of them surrendered without significant resistance, partly because the approach of the coalition was terrifying enough that resistance seemed suicidal, partly because the local lords had long since lost faith in the great power networks that were supposed to protect them. Some cities were taken by assault. The record at Ugarit, which we will get to, shows a city that knew what was coming and could not stop it. He stood at last before the Delta, before Egypt, before Ramesses, and here the record becomes, as I noted before, Egyptian, which means it is Ramesses' record, which means we see a chaos through the eyes of a man who needed to make his victory look as large as possible. The numbers in the Medinet Habu inscription are almost certainly inflated. The description of the coalition as a world-threatening force served Ramesses' narrative purposes regardless of its accuracy. We should not trust the inscription as biography. We should trust it as evidence of scale, something large enough that Ramesses felt it necessary to marshal his entire military and naval force, to innovate his tactics, to record the victory with the exhaustive detail he applied to it. The battle was lost, the fleet was broken, the land column, the march along the coast with the ox carts and the families was stopped. A chaos. If it was a chaos, if the name means anything, died or was captured, or escaped into the chaos that follows every military catastrophe, the dispersal of an army that has just become around. The people he had gathered did not disappear. Dispersal is not dissolution. They became the Philistines, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the settled remnants of a wave that could not crest. They became the people of the Canaanite coast, the inhabitants of Gaza and Ashdod and Ashkelon, the neighbors and enemies of the later Israelites, the other people in a land of contested stories. He, the leader, the gatherer, the man with the gift of listening, he left no monument. No inscription bears his name. No temple was built in his memory. He passed through history like a rumor, and the only trace of him is the fact that things happened. Cities burned. A fleet was broken. A pharaoh felt it necessary to carve the victory into stone on 5 different walls, and a people called the Philistines appeared in the southern Levant and were there when the Hebrew Bible began to be written, and were there when David killed Goliath, and were there until they were not, until even the word for them became an insult, a synonym for the cultureless, the uncivilized, the brute who does not understand beauty. He would have had thoughts about that, I think. A chaos who had gathered a people from the wreckage of the most sophisticated international civilization the world had yet produced, who had organized logistics and commanded ships and maintained coalition politics under conditions of catastrophic stress. He would have had thoughts about being remembered as a brute, but the record did not survive to tell us what they were. The last scribe of Ugarit did not know he was the last scribe of Ugarit. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about him. He got up in the morning in the late summer of around 1185 BCE. The specific date is uncertain, but the archaeology gives us a season, a summer destruction. The grain stored in the palace magazines still identifiable. The olive harvest not yet in. He got up in the morning and he went to the scriptorium and he worked. He sat before his clay tablet and he pressed his stylus into the fresh clay and he wrote what he was told to write, because that is what scribes did, and the system that had employed scribes for a century was still formally operational. The letters that survive from Ugarit's final period are, in their collective effect, one of the most terrifying documents in the archaeological record. They were found in kilns and in the scriptorium itself, baked not by the scribe's intention, but by the fire that destroyed the city, preserved by the very catastrophe they describe. They are letters that were never sent, final communications that arrived and were never answered. One letter from the Hittite viceroy at Carchemish, responding to an Ugaritic appeal for military assistance, is almost unbearably blunt. He says, "The situation is very grave. The enemy ships have appeared in the sea. I cannot send soldiers to you. There are none available." He says, essentially, you are on your own. Another letter from the king of Alashia, Cyprus, to the king of Ugarit describes enemy ships off the Cypriot coast, 7 ships already come and gone, doing evil things. He asks Ugarit to strengthen its defenses. He asks this of a city that was already, apparently, barely holding its defenses together. A third letter, and this one I think about more than is perhaps rational. A third letter is from a Ugaritic official, possibly the city's own king, writing to the Pharaoh. It describes the enemy forces. It says the city's soldiers have gone to the Hittites, the chariots have gone elsewhere, the land is left undefended. It says, these are serious times. It says, save me. The Pharaoh did not save Ugarit. The answer, if there was an answer, does not survive. Ugarit was destroyed around 1185 BCE. The excavations show a violent destruction, burned grain stores, collapsed walls, objects abandoned in mid-use, the small and telling detail of a bronze sword found still in its scabbard, not drawn, the owner apparently without the time to draw it. The last scribe, and here I am consciously, deliberately constructing a figure, distilling the human reality of that scriptorium into a single face. The last scribe would have known what was coming. The letters make clear that the people of Ugarit knew. They were not surprised. They had been watching the system fail around them for months, perhaps years, receiving news from Cyprus, from the Hittite Heartland, from the Levantine cities to the south that were also failing, and they had written to everyone who might help, and the help had not come. There is a thing that happens to people who know a catastrophe is coming and cannot stop it, a particular quality of continuation. The morning routines maintained not because they are possible to maintain forever, but because they are possible to maintain today. And today is what there is. The stylus pressed to clay. The signs made in the ancient way, the way taught by masters who learned it from their masters, the cuneiform tradition that stretch back to Sumer, to the first cities, to the moment human beings decided that writing was possible and necessary and worth teaching. He pressed his stylus to the clay and he wrote, and outside the city the ships were in the harbor and the fire was coming. We do not know his name. The tablets are administrative in character, inventories, correspondence, the daily logistics of a palace system. They do not record the names of the people who wrote them. That too is part of the loss. The scribes of the ancient world were in many cases brilliant, trained, literate in multiple languages, practitioners of a tradition that constituted a kind of intellectual class, and they are largely anonymous to us. They signed their work with the name of the king, not their own. The last tablet. Some scholars identify a tablet found in the kiln room, apparently in process of being baked when the fire overtook the building, as a very late document. The text is an administrative record, grain allocations, the numbers of rations for workers in the palace garden. Someone, at the very end, was counting the grain. The fire came, the writing stopped, the city burned, and 3,000 years later, on a dig site on the Syrian coast, a French archaeologist named Claude Schaeffer opened the first season of excavation at the site that locals called Ras Shamra, the Hill of Fennel, and found the tablets, baked by their own catastrophe to a hardness that time could not undo. He found the last letters. He found the correspondence that described its own failure to arrive. He found the last scribe's work, preserved by the fire that killed him. Anyway, the system fell. It did not fall in a single year, though 1200 BCE has become a kind of symbolic marker, a date that historians use to organize the narrative, even while acknowledging that the reality was more protracted, more complicated, more sad in its gradualness. The collapse was not a single event. It was a cascade, each failure enabling the next, each broken link in the network making the remaining links bear more weight, until they too broke. Think of what it meant, concretely, for the palace system to fail. The palace did not just collect taxes and throw parties. The palace organized the food supply. In a year when the grain harvest was thin, the palace storerooms were supposed to be the buffer, the stored surplus that kept the specialist workers fed, that kept the army in the field, that kept the scribes and the priests and the bronzesmiths productive through the lean months. When the storerooms ran out, the system had no fallback. The specialists disbanded. The workers fed themselves from whatever they could grow or gather or take. The army, unpaid and unfed, either disbanded or became the problem it had been solving. Think of what it meant for the trade networks to fail. The palace bronzesmiths had been producing weapons and tools at scale for centuries. When the copper and tin stopped coming, the bronzesmiths could not work. The weapons they had been producing for the army stopped being produced. The prestige objects that lubricated diplomatic relationships between palaces, the gifts, the tribute, the trade goods that said, "We are still here. We are still powerful. We still recognize each other." Those stopped flowing too. Without the prestige goods, without the evidence of productive power, the diplomatic relationships became empty forms, and empty forms do not hold. And the drought. The drought was the knife blade that everything else was balanced on. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, tells us the Eastern Mediterranean experienced a decades-long period of reduced rainfall beginning in the late 13th century BCE. Not total aridity, not instant crisis, the kind of drought that reduces yields by 20 or 30% year after year until the surplus is gone, until the storerooms are bare, until the buffer that the palace system depended on is a memory, until the thin margin between sustainability and starvation is crossed, not once dramatically, but repeatedly, in different places at different times, spreading the crisis outward like rings from a stone dropped in still water. The cities fell in sequence. Some burned, some were abandoned, some show a gradual shrinkage. The palace ceases to function. The population contracts to the lower town. The lower town empties. The site becomes a village. The village becomes a farm. The farm becomes a ruin. The ruin becomes a hill with a local name that preserves, compressed almost beyond recognition, the ancient name of the city that had stood there. Mycenae did not burn in 1200 BCE. This is a common misconception. Mycenae survived the immediate crisis, kept its walls, maintained a reduced presence on its limestone hill for another generation or two. But the palace economy was gone. The linear B tablets, the writing system the Mycenaeans used, a syllabic script used almost exclusively for palace administration. The linear B tablets stop. There are no linear B tablets after the collapse because the administrative system that produced them no longer existed, because the scribes who wrote them had no palace left to serve, and because when the palace went, the writing went with it. Greece entered what historians call the Dark Ages, and one of the things that was dark about those Dark Ages was the absence of writing. For 3 or 4 centuries, in the former heartland of the Mycenaean civilization, there are no written records, not reduced records, not change records, nothing. The Greeks forgot how to write, and they forgot, or rather, their descendants forgot, the world that the writing had recorded. The great palace of Mycenae became a ruin that later Greeks assumed was the work of giants, because the stones were so enormous that they could not imagine ordinary human beings moving them. They called the style Cyclopean. The Cyclops built those walls, they said, and they were not entirely wrong. It was an act of giant ambition, a scale of organized human effort that by their time was not just gone, but incomprehensible. The world that Homer described, and the date of Homer himself, is disputed. Somewhere in the 8th or 9th century BCE, 3 or 4 centuries after the collapse. The world that Homer described in the Iliad and the Odyssey was already, by his time, a mythologized world, a memory of a memory, a story that had passed through the Dark Ages in oral form, accumulating anachronisms and contradictions and the fingerprints of every generation that had held it and reshaped it before passing it on. The heroes of Troy did not use iron weapons in Homer, they used bronze. The palaces they fought for were the palaces of the late Bronze Age, not the Iron Age world Homer lived in. The epic preserved the memory of the lost age, imperfectly, lovingly, in the only medium available, the human voice. Ugarit burned. Cyprus, Alatia, suffered multiple destruction events in the late 12th century, its major cities damaged or abandoned. The great palace at Enkomi, the administrative center of Cypriot copper production, shows destruction layers. The copper trade, the thing the entire Bronze Age had been built on, contracted dramatically. Cyprus did not disappear. It survived, transformed, eventually became what we now know it as. But the Bronze Age Cyprus, the Cyprus that had been the copper hub of the Mediterranean world, that Cyprus ended. The Hittite Empire vanished, not transformed, not contracted, not reorganized, vanished. The administrative tradition that had maintained itself for 3 centuries, the cuneiform archives, the treaty language, the court protocol, the Hittite language itself, all of it ended within a generation. Anatolia entered its own dark age. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms that survived in the Syrian fringe preserved Hittite cultural elements, but they were, in terms of the original empire's scale and integration, fragments. Egypt survived. This is important and requires explanation. Egypt survived the Sea Peoples militarily, as Ramesses III documented in the exhaustive and operatic records that make him simultaneously the most well-sourced and least reliable narrator of the collapse. Egypt survived because of the specific advantages of the Nile system. The river's annual flood, which renewed agricultural fertility regardless of rainfall in the surrounding region, insulated Egypt from the worst of the climate disruption that devastated the rain-dependent agriculture of Anatolia and the Levant. Egypt could lose the entire late Bronze Age trading network and still feed its population. It could not sustain the palace economy at its previous level, could not maintain the prestige goods production, could not project military power at the scales of the new kingdom's height. But it could keep people alive and keep a state functioning. The state it kept functioning was, however, a diminished thing. The 20th dynasty's later reigns are a series of increasingly weak pharaohs, a court progressively dominated by temple priests and military commanders, a gradual transfer of real power from the palace to the institutions around it, until the new kingdom ended in the third intermediate period and Egypt became, for centuries, a fragmented polity of competing regional powers. The pharaoh's name still had meaning. The sun still rose over the temples of Amun. But the world that had produced the Treaty of Kadesh, the world in which an Egyptian pharaoh could write to the king of Babylon as a brother equal in power, that world was gone. The fall of the late Bronze Age. Some say it took 20 years. Some say it took 100. Both are right, depending on which measure you apply. The aftermath was silence, mostly. The beautiful, terrible silence of an absence so complete that the people who came after had no idea what had been there before. The Iron Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse was not, despite what the name might suggest, a technological leap forward. It was, initially, a degraded adaptation. Bronze was better than iron for many applications. It held an edge better. It was easier to work. It was more corrosion resistant. The shift to iron was not driven by the superior quality of the new material, but by the collapse of the tin supply routes that had made bronze possible. Without tin, you cannot make bronze. With iron, which occurs as ore across much of the Near East and could be smelted by techniques gradually refined through the 12th and 11th centuries, you could make tools and weapons that were not bronze, but were something. The palace redistribution economy did not return. The the complex interdependence of the late Bronze Age, the specialization, the long-distance trade, the administrative systems that tracked and managed the flow of commodities across the Eastern Mediterranean, that did not return, not in the same form. The Iron Age world that emerged was more locally self-sufficient, more politically fragmented, more village-oriented and less palace-oriented, with different trade patterns and different political structures. The great empires of the first millennium BCE, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, were built on different foundations, organized differently, sustained by different mechanisms. The dispersal of peoples in the aftermath of the collapse produced the ethnic and cultural landscape of the Iron Age Levant, the Philistines in the southern coastal plain, the Phoenicians, the inheritors of the Canaanite trading tradition, the people who rebuilt Ugarit's role in a new key along the northern coast in Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, eventually spreading their ships and their alphabet across the entire Mediterranean. The Arameans spreading across the Syrian interior, the early Israelites consolidating in the hill country of Canaan, in the power vacuum left by the collapse of the Egyptian administrative presence. The alphabet is a direct product of the collapse, not the alphabet itself. The Proto-Semitic script that is the ancestor of all alphabets was older, but the diffusion of alphabetic literacy, the spread of a writing system so simple compared to cuneiform and hieroglyphics that it could be learned by merchants and soldiers rather than requiring years of scribal training. The spread of that system was enabled and accelerated by the collapse of the palace scribal traditions. When the palaces fell, the cuneiform and hieroglyphic traditions fell with them. What survived, what filled the writing vacuum, was the alphabetic tradition, and from it descended every alphabet used in the world today. The Phoenician alphabet became the Greek and Aramaic alphabets, which became the Latin and the Hebrew and Arabic scripts, which became the letters you are reading now. The last scribe of Ugarit, pressing his cuneiform stylus to clay in the summer of the destruction, was practicing a technology that was already being superseded by something simpler and more durable. He did not know that. He wrote in the system he had been trained in, the system that had been the mark of civilization for 2,000 years, the system that would not survive the generation, and the alphabet, which required no palace to maintain it, which could be carried in a merchant's head and inscribed in a few hours on a potsherd with a stick of charcoal. The alphabet survived. There is a thought I will not complete here, a thought about fragility and simplicity and the systems that outlived the civilizations that created them, about what it means for a technology to be robust in a way that a civilization is not, but we are not in that territory yet. Or we are, and I should stop. Let me say something about fate, because the Bronze Age collapse is a story that invites fatalism, and I want to push back against it. The temptation is to read the whole thing as inevitable. The complexity was too great. The interdependence was too fragile. The climate was turning. The migration pressure was building. You put those forces together and you get a collapse, and maybe nothing could have stopped it. Maybe Ramesses III's victory just delayed the inevitable. Maybe Suppiluliuma II's naval campaigns were heroic irrelevances. Maybe the last scribe's letters to powers that could not help were always going to go unanswered. I do not believe this. Or rather, I believe it is undecidable, and that the undecidability is the interesting thing. The Bronze Age world was fragile. It was also extraordinary. The Treaty of Kadesh was not an inevitable product of structural forces. It was a political achievement, a thing made by specific human beings who decided that ending the war was better than continuing it, and who had the skill and the institutional support to make that decision real. The maintenance of the trading networks over centuries, across languages and cultural differences and competing political interests, was not automatic. It was work, daily work, the work of scribes and merchants and diplomats and kings who found it in their interest and inclination to maintain the systems of exchange and recognition that made the world function. The world collapsed when those systems were overwhelmed, but they were systems that human beings had made, and they held for a long time, longer than most things hold, longer than most human projects manage to hold together in the face of entropy and violence and natural variation. The collapse was real. The achievement was also real. This is something worth holding. Civilizations end. They end when the forces against them exceed the forces within them. But the forces within them, the scribes and diplomats and merchants and kings who maintained the system, sometimes brilliantly, always imperfectly, those forces were human. The ending was not preordained. The achievement was not inevitable. Both were made. And memory. Memory is the other thing. We remember the Bronze Age collapse now because of the very fragility that caused it. The palace scribal systems, which depended on clay tablets rather than papyrus or parchment, preserved their records in the fire that destroyed them. Ugarit's archive survived because the city burned. The Hittite archive at Hattusa survived because the tablets, when the palace burned, were baked in the fire to a hardness time could not undo. The Mycenaean linear bead tablets were preserved in the destruction layers of the palaces that produced them. The catastrophe was also the preservation event. The collapse baked the record into permanence. There is something close to unbearable in this. The letters that describe the destruction were preserved by the destruction. The scribe who wrote the last letter, asking for help that would not come, wrote it on a medium that would survive 3 millennia and be read by people who knew what he did not know, that the help was not coming, that the city was already lost, that the system he served was at that moment ending. He did not know. He wrote in urgency and hope. The clay preserved it all. I need to say something about order, about what the Bronze Age represents in the long history of human attempts to organize the world. The late Bronze Age palace civilizations were not the first complex societies. Sumer was earlier. The Indus Valley civilization was earlier. Old Kingdom Egypt was earlier. But the late Bronze Age represents something specific. The first genuinely international order. The first time that multiple major civilizations across a wide geographic area had organized themselves into a system of mutual recognition, regulated exchange, and acknowledged interdependence. It was imperfect, hierarchical, often violent, maintained by the real or implicit threat of force. It was also, in its functioning, a remarkable human accomplishment. Every international order that has existed since, the Hellenistic world, the Roman Empire, the medieval trading networks, the early modern European state system, the post-World War II institutions. Every such order has faced the same fundamental tension, the tension between the benefits of integration and the risks of interdependence, between the stability that shared systems provide and the fragility that complex systems carry inherently, between the genuine goods that order creates and the coercion that maintaining order requires. The Bronze Age collapse is not a lesson. I want to be careful here. History is suspicious of people who want it to be a lesson, because the desire for lessons is the desire for a usable past. And the past resists being useful in the ways we want. The Bronze Age collapse cannot teach us exactly what will happen in the next systemic crisis, because the specifics are too different, the mechanisms too varied, the context too particular. But it can remind us of something, of the scale of what is possible when complex systems fail, of the speed with which achieved complexity can come undone, of the fact that the sophistication of a civilization is not a guarantee of its continuity, that the most intricate and accomplished systems can collapse into silence faster than anyone living within them would have believed possible. The scribes of Ugarit believed their system was real. They had every reason to believe it. It had been real for centuries. The letters they wrote and received, the protocols they followed, the administrative procedures they maintained. These were not fictions. They were genuinely functional. And then they were not. And the scribes could not see, from inside the system, the moment when function became fiction, when the protocol continued, but the substance had already gone. Anyway, we come now to a moment I find difficult to locate precisely in the narrative, a moment that I can only describe as the shiver you get when the ancient story reaches across and touches the present, and then pulls back, because the present is not where this story lives, and the distance between then and now is not a bridge to walk across, but a gulf to stand at the edge of and feel the depth of. I will not name the analogy that is forming. It forms, and I let it pass. The late Bronze Age world was not our world. The systems are different. The mechanisms are different. The scale is different. The story does not repeat. It rhymes at best, and sometimes the rhyme is imperfect, a half rhyme, a near miss. The echo of a word is not quite the same word. The shiver passes. We are back in 1185 BCE. The smoke above Ugarit, the silence above Hattusa, the darkness after the collapse, the Greek Dark Ages, the Levantine Dark Ages, the general informational silence that covers the Eastern Mediterranean for 2 to 4 centuries after 1200 BCE. This darkness was not total. People lived, communities survived. The hill country of Canaan was, if anything, more densely settled in the Iron Age than before, filled with the dispersed populations of the coastal cities that had burned or contracted. Cyprus rebuilt. The Phoenician cities, Byblos, survived. Sidon survived. Tyre grew to prominence, maintained fragments of the late Bronze Age trading tradition, and, over the following centuries, rebuilt something like a Mediterranean commercial network, less centralized, less palace-dependent, more resilient because it was decentralized, more flexible because it was driven by individual merchants rather than palace administrators. The Phoenicians invented, or rather popularized and spread, the alphabet that made this new flexibility possible. An alphabet that any literate person could use without years of scribal training was an alphabet that could travel without a palace to support it. The Phoenician merchants who sailed to Carthage and Spain and Britain carried their writing system with them and left it behind when they left or died, and the writing system did not require the institutional support of a palace to keep functioning. The broken metaphor, and I know I'm giving you the seams, which is the point, which is what I promised. The broken metaphor is this. The late Bronze Age was like a cathedral, built over centuries, maintained by dedicated specialists, structurally magnificent and structurally dependent, every stone load-bearing, every element in precise relationship with every other element. And what replaced it was something more like a market or a bazaar or a network of trails in a forest. Not magnificent, not planned, not centrally maintained, but persistent in a way the cathedral was not, because no single stone was essential, because the whole did not require the parts to be in their assigned places. The metaphor almost works. It doesn't quite work. Cathedrals are not like that, actually, not literally. Cathedrals are quite sturdy, and many of them are still standing. And the late Bronze Age was not literally a cathedral. The analogy gestures at something real and then fails to hold it. I leave it there because the failure is honest. The memory of the Bronze Age collapse entered the cultural record through the epics and the religious texts of the peoples who survived it. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are, at one level, stories about the last generation of the Bronze Age, the heroes who fought at Troy, the city that may have been the historical Wilusa of the Hittite records, a city on the Anatolian coast whose destruction is archaeologically attested around 1200 BCE. The Trojan War in Homer is a late Bronze Age conflict told through the mouths of Iron Age Greeks who had inherited a tradition of songs about that world without fully understanding what that world had been. The result is a palimpsest, Bronze Age material preserved under Iron Age overlay, the great palace world of Agamemnon and Priam, shining through the simpler world of the poem's composition like a watermark in paper. The Hebrew Bible carries the memory too. The Philistines, those settled remnants of the Sea Peoples Coalition, appear throughout the early books as the great adversary, the people of the coastal plain, the uncircumcised, the enemy. The conflict between Israel and Philistia that runs through Samuel and Kings is at one level a religious and ethnic conflict, but at another level it is the last echo of the Bronze Age collapse playing out in slow motion. The displaced peoples of the collapse settling next to each other in the power vacuum the collapse created. The old enmities and competitions continuing in a new key. The memory of a connected world preserved in the word for the land itself, Palestine, from Philistine, from the people who had come off the ships in the year of the burning, when the great system fell. The Greeks remembered Troy. The Hebrews remembered the Philistines. The Egyptians remembered the Sea Peoples. In the temple records that Ramesses III left at Medinet Habu, the Hittites, they remembered nothing because there were no Hittites left to remember. Not as Hittites, not as a tradition. The Hittite language was lost for 3,000 years until late 19th and early 20th century scholars deciphered the tablets of Hattusa and discovered, to their considerable astonishment, that the language was Indo-European, distantly related to Greek and Latin and Sanskrit, a cousin to the languages of the civilization that had eventually, long after the collapse, covered the eastern Mediterranean again. The story did not end. I mean this in the literal sense, not as comfort. The peoples who lived through the Bronze Age collapse did not know they had lived through an event that scholars 3,000 years later would study as a paradigm case of systemic collapse. They knew their city had burned, or their trade network had dried up, or their palace had stopped paying them, or the ships had stopped coming. They knew the world was harder than it had been. Some of them, the survivors of specific destructions, knew violence and loss at the scale that violence and loss operate. The particular, the named, the person who was there and then was not. The patterns, the cascade, the fragility, the system's inability to absorb multiple simultaneous shocks. Those patterns were not visible from inside the event. They are visible from here, from the distance of 3 millennia, with the benefit of the archaeology and the textual analysis and the climate science and the comparative history that were not available to anyone living in 1185 BCE. But the story, the human story, the story of people navigating catastrophe with the tools they had, making choices under impossible pressure, sometimes choosing well and sometimes not, writing letters to powers that could not answer, leading coalitions of the dispossessed, carving victories into stone, surviving in ways that created new problems for the next generation. That story is as old as stories. It is the story of the Pharaoh who saved his kingdom and was killed by his family. The story of the last king who fought with everything he had and disappeared into the silence of a burning capital. The story of the chieftain who gathered the dispossessed and led them to the one border that held and fell against it. The story of the scribe who wrote, in the urgency of the end, letters that would not arrive. These are not metaphors. These are specific people, or the categories that specific people inhabited, people whose actual flesh and bone existence left traces in clay and stone that have survived to be read. The archetype is real because the experience is real. The pattern recurs because the underlying conditions recur. The complexity that exceeds its own resilience, the system that optimizes until it cannot absorb disruption, the moment when the letters stop being answered. There is a tradition. I am not sure this is widely enough known to be called a tradition, but let me call it one. A tradition among scholars of the Bronze Age collapse of ending their accounts with a version of the observation that what the collapse demonstrates, above all, is the fragility of civilization. The observation is true. It is also, I want to suggest, incomplete. The fragility is real. The 3,000-year silence of Hittite, the 4-century absence of writing from Greece, the disappearance of Ugarit from the surface of the world for 32 centuries, until Schaeffer's spade found the hill of fennel and the baked tablets within it. These are real losses, real absences, real demonstrations of how completely a sophisticated civilization can disappear. But the achievement was also real. The Bronze Age world made things that lasted. The Treaty of Kadesh hangs in the United Nations. The memory of Troy entered Homer, and through Homer, the entire Western literary tradition. The Phoenician alphabet became every alphabet. The Philistines gave Palestine its name. The sea peoples, scattered and defeated and settled across the Levantine coast, became the people among whom the Hebrew Bible was written. And the Hebrew Bible changed the world in ways that are still unfolding. The system broke. The pattern survived. The scribe's clay tablets, baked by the fire that killed him, are in museums now. The letters he wrote that never arrived have been read by thousands of people who know what he did not know, who know the city burned, who carry, in reading his words, a kind of proxy grief for the world he was trying to preserve. We are the people who read those letters. We are the continuation of the story that the Bronze Age began. The Bronze Age collapse is not just a historical event. It is the event that set the conditions for the world we live in, that scattered the peoples who became the Greeks and the Hebrews and the Phoenicians, that destroyed the palace systems and thereby created the space for the decentralized, alphabetic, commercially driven, politically fragmented world from which, eventually, through 1,000 years of further transformation, modernity emerged. The last scribe of Ugarit was writing. The last king of Hatti was fighting. The last great pharaoh was building his temple, carving his victory, wrapping his murdered body in linen for an eternity he had earned and would inhabit alone. The chieftain from the burning shores was gathering the dispossessed into something that would become, in the next generation, a settled people with their own name and their own stories. All of them were inside the story. None of them could see its shape. We are outside the story now. We can see the shape. It is the shape of everything that has ever been built beyond what could be sustained and lost and found again in fragments by the people who came after. It is the shape of letters that arrive too late, of kings who fight brilliantly for something that is already gone, of scribes who keep the records until there is no palace left to serve, of refugees who become founders, of survivors who become, eventually, ancestors. The Bronze Age ended. The Iron Age came. The classical civilizations rose from the scattered seeds: Rome, Greece, the Levantine religions, the alphabets, the trade networks rebuilt on different foundations. The world continued. It always continues. That is both the comfort and the terror of it. Good night, wherever you are. Put down whatever you're holding and sit with it for a moment. The silence, the distance, the particular quality of the dark after a story about darkness. The scribes are still writing in their fashion. The tablets are still baking in fires we have not yet lit. The letters are still traveling, and some of them will not arrive, but some of them will. Good night.